Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today I'm joined with Monistic Idealism, and we are going to be reviewing and critiquing a video by the guy named I Am David Long. So I'll share the screen. So as you can see here, there's already there's a lot of more dislikes than likes, so it's not looking too well for him so far. So hopefully we could sort of, because I mean, if you go to the comments, you'll see some of the criticisms, but we're hoping that this video can sort of summarize at least the main criticisms that we have and provide some feedback for him as well. Because when I watched this the first time, I was really like cringing a lot because there's just so many bad arguments. So yeah, what did you think of it?
Yeah, there was few misunderstandings on the difference between science and metaphysics and just philosophy in general. And there was a lot of assumptions in the background that weren't fleshed out. And so I think when we get to talk about that a bit more, it'll make things a bit more clear as to why a lot of other people are objecting in the comments and why, even if you're not an idealist, that you would have a problem with some of the arguments made in this video.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's play it then. Oh, by the way, I just want to warn you guys that the audio for his audio is actually not that good for like the first 15 minutes. It gets a little better later, so just want to clarify on that. Anyways, let's get started.
What's up? I am David Long. I'm here today to talk about idealism. I am going to watch a video by Bernardo about his small theory of everything. Bernardo Kastrup.
At the Future of Brain Health Symposium only a couple of days ago in Amsterdam, I gave a presentation that encapsulates a clean, quick, brief summary of my philosophical views, of my ontological views. And what I wanted to do now is to give you a new edition, a new spin of that presentation, in which I have a little more time to talk about the details, but still keep it simple. I call it my small theory of everything. Small because it's quite simple. The difficulty in it is just to overcome our implicit, built-in assumptions and prejudices about the nature of reality. But if you can take that small shift in perspective, what I'm going to talk about is actually very simple, almost in your face. So here we go, a brief introduction to my small theory of everything. And of course, we start from this big question, this big mystery in science today, which is the mind and brain relationship. It has been chosen by Science Magazine in its anniversary edition in 2005 as the second most important unanswered question in science. The first question being the nature of matter. I would say it should have been the first question, the relationship between mind and brain. Because whatever we say about matter is conditional, is dependent on this fundamental relationship between mind and brain. All of our knowledge is in mind, after all. Now, that there is a relationship between mind and brain is clear. We can stimulate certain regions of the brain, which leads to marked changes in our subjective experience of reality, in our emotions, and our thoughts, and so on. Psychoactive drugs have an influence on the brain and they change how we feel subjectively about life, about ourselves, about the world. Brain trauma has a marked effect on our inner life. So that there is a relationship between mind and brain is empirically obvious. And many people take it for granted that the brain generates the mind, like the liver generates bile, that the mind is the product, the outcome of brain function. The problem, however, is what is called in philosophy and neuroscience the hard problem of consciousness, which is that there is nothing to the properties and dynamics of matter that allow us to deduce the qualities of experience. We do not even know how to think about how the feeling of seeing red, the feeling of loving someone, the feeling of being afraid, how any of those subjective experiences can arise out of mass, momentum, charge, and spin, the properties of matter. There seems to be an unbridgeable gap between these two worlds.
This is one of the things you notice. Whenever you talk to somebody from a worldview, they have a strict narrative around their way of thinking about things. Like, look at these Trumpers. You see consistent patterns. Every time you talk to one of them and you bring up something, they have the same defense.
Fake news. Fake news. Fake news.
And the way that these idealists always talk about science is as if it's some kind of a dogma or some kind of way of thinking that people just take completely uncritically. People just accept it without thinking. They just take it for granted. It's just a dogma. It's an ideology. They'll use all kinds of words, especially religious words.
Bernardo himself never says that science is a dogma. He never uses these words like doctrine or anything like that. He does talk about emergentism as magical thinking, but he's really careful around the science thing because a lot of his case relies on appeals to authority and trying to equate what he thinks with science. So he wants to walk a really thin line here around science. He wants to, on one hand, imply that these people are just taking things for granted or are caught up in magical thinking, but on the other hand, he does want to be able to appeal to science, scientific papers, and scientific authorities where it suits him. And he's also an academic and a doctor, so he's going to be real careful around some of this. A lot of times, other people go really hard on this point.
We'll see a little bit later when we get to the part with Deepal Chopra that this is definitely something that he does.
After stopping the jihadists and the Vatican of conservative and orthodox science.
This is something I've seen a lot, but Bernardo's definitely playing it safe, being very careful about his language around some of this stuff. He talks about it like
our implicit, built-in assumptions and prejudices about the nature of reality. And many people take it for granted and appeal to magic.
But the truth is that the reason...
Okay, real quick, I have a comment I could add to some of this real fast. So, all right, so earlier he was talking about what idealists see science as a sort of dogma.
Yeah.
And as an idealist, yeah, that's not true. I don't see it. I mean, there's many different ways that we can conceive science. But I think what Kastrup is talking about here is We're really
Different.
talking about materialism or physicalism, as we want to call it. And so that is a comprehensive metaphysical theory that does see the world through a certain lens. So yes, they're going to have their own assumptions and all that. And so I think Kastrup is just referring to those, and he's going to address them and show how there's a problem there. And we may rhetorically refer to it as a dogma, and you could see it as a dogma. It is for some people, certainly, but yeah, we can still address it for what it is. And
Right. And I think it's important with when we talk about later with the philosophy of science, because he does equate science with physicalism a lot in this video.
Yes. And this is not uncommon. A lot of people do this.
Yeah. But yeah, I would say the same thing you said, which is basically that no, Kastrup is not trying to say that science is a dogma, because science is really just, again, we'll get into it more later, but like basically science is a useful tool, but it's not going to actually tell you anything about the ontological nature of reality, which we'll get into that more later. But that's just the first sort of issue I want to point out to people, right? So yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
Is because science has had to work real hard against the status quo, which was a more religious, idealistic way of thinking about the world, for a real long time to prove and establish itself. So when people talk about dogma around these things, it's like they don't know what dogma means. Dogma is something that is handed down, that is to be accepted without question, without skepticism, without doubt. You just believe it. And let's be real, science is not dogma. Scientific knowledge is not something that people just believe in. It's not a belief system. And the conclusions that people have come to as the dominant theories across multiple disciplines is because of explanatory power and hard work and proof and evidence. So if the general community of science at this point in the development of science history come to a consistent conclusion about something across multiple disciplines, it's probably because there's pretty good firm reasons and evidence to come to that conclusion. People will point to things in the past where science got things wrong, but in general, those are not things that science got things wrong. Those are points where science learned and we moved forward as a species. And just the fact that they can prove that science proved it wrong and got better is just proof for science that it can refine with peer review over time, and the bad ideas get weeded out. So something to look out for, this idea that science is dogma. Let's also talk a little bit about this hard problem of consciousness, which is basically, we don't know how you get experience out of just stuff. It doesn't make any sense to us. And they're always like, where's the mechanism? And it's like, that is not how it works. It's not even just stuff. It's like the same thing with this video that we're watching. It's not that it just happened one day and there's a single mechanism for it. The way that it was possible was because it's an emergent property of all of these different factors coming together, and no one thing on its own would have made it work. It's like this God of the gaps argument.
There seems to be an unbreachable.
Okay, we'll get more to that, but I think that's the other that's the other problem.
Definitely. I think he's not forming a hard problem quite accurately.
I know. Well, that's the thing. He's not actually presenting the hard problem in the correct way, right? So he's completely misrepresenting what the hard problem actually is, right?
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I got something I could read off here real fast. The short quote. Yeah. It's from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So it says here, in more detail, the challenge arises because it does not seem that the qualitative and subjective aspects of conscious experience, how consciousness feels, and the fact that it is directly for me, fit into a physicalist ontology, one consisting of just the basic elements of physics, plus structural, dynamical, and functional combinations of those basic elements. It appears that even a complete specification of a creature in physical terms leaves unanswered the question of whether or not the creature is conscious. And it seems that we can easily conceive of creatures just like us physically and functionally that nonetheless lack consciousness. This indicates that a physical explanation of consciousness is fundamentally incomplete. It leaves out what it is like to be the subject for the subject. And I don't think this is necessarily just some appeal to a gap. There appears to be a contradiction here, right? If we're going to say the world is exhaustively quantitative and objective, there is no room for a phenomenon like consciousness that is qualitative and subjective.
No, and that's why the hard problem exists, right? Because on a physicalist picture of the world, everything is fundamentally non-conscious, non-experiential, right? Just literally mindless matter, right? Like on that picture of the world, there is no way to get consciousness, because even if you're talking about functions, right, which he'll get into later, but like even when you talk about functions, well, we can always ask, hey, why does that function have experience? This is something that David Chalmers points out, where just because you appeal to a function, that's not going to actually explain why there's experience, right? Like you can have the function without there being experience, and that's the problem with physicalism, right? Or a sort of reductive physicalism, is that there just doesn't seem, it seems to be the wrong materials for building consciousness, right? You're just using the wrong. It's like trying to build numbers out of pencils or something, right? It's just fundamentally they're not the same thing. And this is why, again, I want to emphasize to the audience that, and to those watching, when we're talking about ontologies, we're talking about the ultimate nature, fundamental nature of what things are. And so if the fundamental ultimate nature of what things are is mindless matter, well, there's no room for consciousness in there, because consciousness is something completely qualitatively different than, this abstract world of non-conscious mindless matter, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how the mindless matter functions, it's still going to be mindless matter, and that's the problem. You're not going to actually be able to explain why there's consciousness in there, right? So
yeah, and we'll get into a little bit more later about because he does talk about how you can't reduce one aspect to the other, but we'll show others problems for physicalism or materialism with that. So we'll continue.
Yeah. Well, there's the hard problem. How do we get these things out of these simpler things? There are explanations to be had, but it's not like purely material even, because part of how we're able to experience things in reality is because we have concepts and social programming, ways of talking about our experience that make us more than just billiard balls hitting up against things. There's interpretation. So there's experience and interpretation. Basically, from an integral perspective, if you're wanting the answer to how something like consciousness works, and you're only willing to look at exterior factors to be able to explain interior phenomenon, you're never going to get the answer, because you've set up a problem that's impossible to answer.
What do you think of?
We'll see. Yeah, right. Well, I mean,
yeah,
he's going to have to be more clear about what his version of materialism would be.
Yeah.
Or even if he's not a materialist, if he doesn't want to identify as that, he needs to be more clear what he means here, because
right there,
reductive physics was. Oh, go ahead.
That is a good way of pointing out the way he just described it. That is a good way of at least presenting the hard problem. Is, well, if you're only talking about the exterior, right, and like if you're only talking about what can be quantitatively described in in physical terms, right, then of course you're not going to be able to explain the internal world of consciousness, because they're two totally different things. So it's funny that he brings this up, like this problem. It's like, well, you set up a problem that is impossible to solve. Well, of course it's impossible to solve. That is the hard problem, right? I just found that funny.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, I mean, for a reductive physicalist, they want to say what he's identifying as this exterior phenomenon. That's what all phenomenon is. What he's identifying as this interior is actually supposed to be exterior. There isn't this dualism, unless he wants to be a dualist.
Yeah.
And so he's going to get into some problems there. If he wants to say that the interior is not reducible to the exterior, he's only going to get himself into more trouble, right? And he's landing on his own sword there, because it's like that's what Kastrup is basically trying to tell you, right? That's what the hard problem is, like you said, that you can't actually reduce it, and this is the problem that follows. So he's just not carrying this far enough to see what the problem is.
It's funny because, I mean, just one last thing before we continue. Kastrup, what he talks about, like he says that it's a logical conceptual problem. So basically, the reason why the hard problem exists, it only exists in the context of physicalism, right? So outside the context of physicalism, if you're not a physicalist, it's not going to really apply, but it only applies in the context of physicalism because it just shows a contradiction within the framework itself, right? So
yeah, and another quick comment. Notice how when he looks at the top left corner that he calls the interior, notice how every other quadrant actually kind of does seem like it's from a perspective of an individual, right?
Well, that's,
you're still looking at it from at what he's calling exterior. You could easily identify as interior, but anyway, we'll continue.
Yeah. Let's continue.
Basically asking how the upper right alone can explain the upper left, and that's always going to be a reductionist answer.
Imagine if a person had never seen movies or videos or computers before and you tried to show them this stuff. They'd be like, how does the camera capture these images? And they would look at the hardware of the computer and they would be like, how do you edit this video with this device? How do you go from these little weird computer chip things to editing videos? Show me the device on here that allows for you to edit videos. I don't understand. Point to it. It's like, well, that's not really how it works. Maybe then you would pull up the code, the binary code, the software that allows for the video editing program. And that's all ones and zeros. They're like, what? Tell me how you get from ones and zeros to a video. That makes no sense to me. That's like magic. It's like, yeah, it is kind of like magic, but it does work in a particular practical way. So even though you get to experience all this amazing presentation that's happening in this video, all of these realities, all of these emotion evoking images
in rapid succession. All of these new worlds generated in a way that would be considered magic to people who don't understand what is going on can be explained practically, not in terms of a reductionist approach to just hardware or just software. These things alone cannot fully explain this emergent phenomenon, which is actually the outgrowth of all of these systems coming together. And the same is true for consciousness. We may not have all the answers yet, but we do have plenty of answers. And in general, we know that this is the case. Sure, there are some gaps in our knowledge, but not gaps so big that you can fit these ridiculous idealistic theories within.
There's nothing to the property.
Right, what do you think about his comparison with the hard problem with hardware and software?
Well, yeah. Well, I feel like
yeah.
we kind of already went over that, right?
Mhm.
Like if he wants to, he just needs to be more clear about what he's saying, right? If he wants to say that what we're calling the mind is not reducible to the so-called hardware, then now we're getting into something that's a lot more like dualism. We got to talk about how they interact.
Mhm.
He's going away from what a lot of these mainstream physicalists are trying to say. And so, what was the last thing he said right before you pause it? He was talking about...
Yeah, I'll go back like 30 to 20 seconds.
Yeah, there was one thing he
Actually,
said.
the outgrowth of all of these systems coming together. And the same is true for consciousness. We may not have all the answers yet, but we do have plenty of answers. And in general, we know that this is the case. Sure, there are some gaps in our knowledge, but not gaps so big that you can fit these ridiculous idealistic theories.
Okay, yeah. So, right, like I said before, I know a lot of people use this language of gap. You know, even Kastrup uses that, but I see a contradiction. Okay, so if you're a kind of reductive physicalist, or even a non-reductive physicalist, these are contradictory, they're wrong, so we need an alternative. It's not like there's some hole and we're going to plug it with idealism. It's that we need an alternative framework,
kind of like
another metaphysical theory.
Yeah, just like the whole for idealism is going to be like how to explain subjects, right? And we'll talk about Kastrup about that in May, but that's a whole, right? But that's not a contradiction, right? It can at least make conceptually sense that idealism could explain why there's individual minds, right? But here it seems like the hard part is actually contradiction, right? So there's a huge difference between those. But yeah, anyways, let's continue.
There's nothing to the properties and dynamics of matter that allow us to deduce the qualities of experience. We do not even know how to think about how the feeling of seeing red, the feeling of loving someone, the feeling of being afraid, how any of those subjective experiences can arise out of mass, momentum, charge, and spin, the properties of matter. There seems to be an unbridgeable gap between these two worlds, and it's known as the hard problem of consciousness, and it has not been solved, and we have not made progress towards solving it. Now, there are at least two mainstream hypotheses about this relationship between mind and brain. The first one is what's called emergence, the idea that consciousness, subjectivity, is an emergent property of the brain. There are many instances of emergence in nature that are well known. For instance, the fractal patterns of snowflakes. We can even simulate the formation of snowflakes on a computer. So in every known instance of emergence, we can deduce the emergent property from the characteristics of the lower level components of the system, except for consciousness. We cannot deduce, not even in principle, how it feels to see red, how it feels to love someone, how it feels to be afraid from the mass, charge, spin, and momentum of the subatomic particles making up the brain. As such, to say that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain is the mere labeling of a fundamental unknown. We just gave it a name and we feel warm and fuzzy as if we had explained anything. Nothing has been explained.
This dude acts like scientists have been doing nothing on this topic. Like we have no data on this topic. It's dishonest. This is dishonest what he's saying right now. Like you have definitely...
Oh man. See, this is where he confuses physicalism with science.
Right.
Want me to finish what he's saying and then
mapped emergent phenomenon to equipment, and we have one-to-one correlations. Destroy parts of the brain and functions are lost. This whole there's no information or data. We know nothing about how this could work. It's very, very similar to the way that Christians talk about evolution. The parallels are all there.
Well, if evolution is true, then why are there still monkeys? Which they think is a good question, but it isn't.
These people are basically denying evolution. Because evolution and emergentism are the interior and exterior sides of the same coin. The map of the interiors of consciousness correlates to the development of beings over time through evolution. So to be like, oh, we have no idea how this happened, it's just a God of the gaps argument.
Alternatively, it's an appeal to magic. We're basically giving a name to the magic arisal of subjective experience from allegedly that matter. It's an appeal to magic, and again, it doesn't explain anything.
So science knows nothing. They're basically talking about magic. Their beliefs are equivalent to magic.
First, let's get rid of the scientists. If we can dismantle science and not talk about science, and not have to deal with facts or evidence or logic about how reality works, then my theory and ideas work just great.
And like so many of these idealists, like
I have my mathematical proof for God. I have my logical case for why God is real.
it's always some fish like this with these people. And the only people who that's at all convincing to are people who already really want to believe it. No one's trying to falsify this thing and prove it. They're all trying to make a case for it. That's the difference between real science and pseudoscience, by the way, is the real science will try to disprove something, to falsify something, to knock something down to see if it stands up.
We try this on, try to kill like this, and we prove that this thing will stand under any of these circumstances, no matter what you do to it.
That's science, as opposed to this.
Well, I found this. This idea could prop it up nicely. You just gotta ignore this, nor this.
These people are not doing good integration. They're trying to make a case for their ideas. They're frantically grabbing for things that look like it could fit. The way to go is try to disprove every idea. Only take the ones that really, really stand when you're really critical of them. Who cares about what you want to believe in? Let's figure out what's actually true and good and align ourselves with that.
The problem is so serious that some materialist philosophers, in order to get around this problem instead of solving it, have proposed with a serious face that consciousness itself is an illusion, that the brain computes that it is conscious, but it isn't really. If you think about it, this is absurd. I can create a computer program that creates a variable called conscious, and then after very complex calculations, attributes the Boolean value true to the variable conscious, such that conscious is true, and that will not make the computer any more conscious than otherwise. The manipulation of symbols and the attribution of values to symbols doesn't make anything conscious. This is so obvious. Consciousness is the only carrier of reality we or anyone can ever know. Knowledge resides in consciousness. What has never been in consciousness in anyone's mind might as well not exist. To say that consciousness is an illusion is an absurdity. It requires an arbitrary redefinition of the word consciousness in a way that is simply not what people mean when they say consciousness.
It's not what people mean when they say consciousness. Well, guess what? Most people don't know what consciousness is. Is that a fair assessment of what's going on? Most people don't understand what consciousness is. So who cares what most people mean when they say consciousness? What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the ability to be self-aware, to know what our feelings are, to perceive ourselves and the world around us. They're saying consciousness is an illusion. What they mean is consciousness has this idea of a soul or a true self or a spiritual essence is an illusion. So this is a problem with what
yeah, real quick, that's actually not what they're saying.
Yeah.
An eliminative materialist or an eliminative physicalist, they want to say what we identify as mental states do not exist. Like thoughts, ideas, beliefs, feelings, to them, they are not real.
Yeah, I know. That's the thing is, like, we're not talking about souls here. Like, I don't even know what soul means, but like, they're literally saying that experience, like, are not, like, when we talk about feelings, emotions, etc., like, those things are actually not real at all, right? That's what they're saying. That's what the eliminativists are saying.
Yeah,
so
or the illusionists. That's basically what they're saying. Yeah, the reductive materialist does want to say that they're real. There are beliefs and desires and such, but they are reducible to physical phenomena like some brain state or something. So that's the important distinction there that I think you got confused on.
No, yeah. Let's continue.
Consciousness even means. What do you even mean when you say consciousness?
So when Bernardo says,
I can create a computer program that creates a variable called conscious, and then after very complex calculations, attributes the Boolean value true to the variable conscious, such that conscious is true, and that will not make the computer any more conscious than otherwise.
So how is what he's saying about this computer any different from what these scientists are saying about us?
Consciousness itself is an illusion, that the brain computes that it is conscious, but it isn't really.
How are we any different from this computer that after complicated calculations, we just associate the idea of consciousness with true? It's the same basic idea. And we only have the equipment that we're working with to be able to interpret our experience or to be able to be conscious of anything. To be conscious of something means that you're experiencing it and aware of it. So that means you're using the equipment you have, like your eyes and your ears and your brain and the concepts you have through social conditioning to interpret your experience. And we call that consciousness. So this is a combination of different factors, biology, relative meanings and values that come out of living in environments that shape what becomes our experience of consciousness. It's not that consciousness is primary. It's that consciousness is the emergent quality of all of these different factors coming together.
Tell me, what is love?
Love is first widening my eyes a little bit and quickening my breathing a little and warming my skin and touching.
And so on. Exactly so. Thank you, Shu.
They're saying what you think of as conscious is an illusion. It's a type of software run on the brain, and it is like a bunch of concepts related to feelings and experiences. That's
okay, that's fine. I mean, he could say that, right? But then why are you even calling it consciousness? Like, it just seems like a label at that point, right? If you're just going to say that consciousness is literally just these biological processes or whatever, like, then why even call it consciousness, right? You're just eliminating it. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah, because you must say, well, what's the difference between that robot and us? Well, there is nothing that it is like to be that robot. Just because you have a bunch of these parts, which are themselves not conscious, just because you combine them together, okay, and now you have this complex behavior that's now coming about, that does not imply at all that there is this subjective experience. And if you want to say that there is, you're going to have to explain how you know that and how that comes about. And later on in the video, he does talk about how, well, it's just an emergent property, like that's just what it is. And even Kastrup points out how that doesn't answer the question. That doesn't really explain at all how this happens. And that's a major weakness because they want to, it depends on your version of physicalism. If you want to be a reductionist, then this should be easy for you. There should be no problem. You should have all the details you need, or at least have a roadmap to how you're going to get there. And he hasn't offered one in this video. But if he's a non-reductionist, I mean...
It sounds like he's a non-reductionist.
Yeah. So I'll wait till he says a bit more, but I have some things to say about that version of emergence. Because, I don't know if he said this so far, there are two main versions of emergence.
Yeah.
And it wasn't spelled out in this video. There's weak emergence and strong emergence. Weak emergence has to deal mainly with phenomenon that's reducible. So like, 5 fingers, the 5-fingeredness, right? We would say that's a weakly emergent phenomenon. But people like this guy, if we're interpreting correctly, want to say that consciousness is not like that it's a completely different phenomenon that comes from the physical, but is itself not physical. And that's going to lead into some big problems.
Yeah. We'll get to that later. So, all right.
That's what consciousness is. It's an emergent property. Your biology and your interpretive filter that you've learned come together to interpret your experience, and you build a narrative around that, a concept of self. You recognize yourself, that things in the world are happening to you. This is all concepts. This is all ideas. And without these ideas, one isn't said to be conscious. And there is no self. It is a concept. It's like free will. It's not real. To really be awake, to really be conscious is, to some extent, assume that you know what's going on in reality, that you're actually perceiving what's happening, that you're aware. And most people aren't aware. To say, how can you deny consciousness? It's like, who do you think is conscious? Who do you think is really awake and aware? Who do you think really knows what's going on in this context? I don't think you do, Mr. Bernardo.
And when Bernardo says,
what has never been in consciousness in anyone's mind might as well not exist.
Here he's reducing everything to personal experience and completely negating context, the context in which conscious beings have come to exist, as if development and evolution aren't real or don't matter. Here's a supposed scientist saying that what we don't know about may as well not exist and doesn't matter. When have you heard a scientist talk about the unknown like this?
And you guys notice the cringy background music too? It's like, I'm telling you the secrets of the universe. Snowflakes, you guys. Snowflakes.
Real quick, I got something to add to that.
What was that?
Real quick, because he says, well, when have you heard scientists talk like that? I'm pretty sure Richard Dawkins and all these new atheist types say that.
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, if it's not describable by physics, it's
then it's
supernatural, and it's just a bunch of woo-woo spooky stuff. Like, if you can't put it in a test tube, then it's not real. It's like,
and that's the problem. Like, when he's literally talking about the type of new atheist type of people. So yeah. Okay, let's get started. Let's continue.
Either the labeling of an unknown, an appeal to magic, in which in both cases nothing is explained, or absurdity, like the idea that consciousness is an illusion.
So yeah, like I said, almost anytime you argue with an idealist, they don't start by being like, okay, I looked at all the evidence, I tried to figure out what's going on, and when I really look at all the things that are happening in the world, and I've really, thought out from the ground up what might be going on, let me tell you my case for idealism, how I come from this idea of I think therefore I am, and other people exist, to this conclusion that idealism in this kind of way. They don't do that.
Okay, well that's just false. We do. That is exactly what we do.
That.
Yeah, I know.
That's exactly what we do.
Because what we do basically, I mean, I don't want to get too much into details, but we start off with experience, right? And then we just say, okay, what's the simplest sort of theory, right? And we say, okay, well, we talk about our experience, right? As Kastrup says, we talk about like there's something it is like to be, there's experience in and of itself. There's something it's like to be the subject for the subject, right? We take this broad concept of experience. And when I'm talking about experience, I just want to clarify that I'm not talking about self-reflexive experience. I'm just talking about experience more generally. So even if you don't have knowledge of your experience, you're still experiencing something, like, when you're dreaming and you don't remember the dream or something. So we take that concept of experience, the broadest sense of it, and then we just apply it to reality. We just say all that really exists is experience. There's the personal experience and then there's transpersonal experience. But at the end of the day, it's all experience. We can explain everything in terms of experience. There's no reason to posit this world that is beyond experience, this world that's this mindless reality that exists beyond experience that we can't really have access to, right? That is like that is the sort of argument that Kastrup would use, where it's just simple, just to posit experience, something that we directly know, right? And then we can explain everything in terms of experience, right? So that seems to be the best.
Like one of the ways I've gotten there and how a lot of others have gotten there is that, we've meditated on the hard problem of consciousness. We want to account for the existence, irreducibility, and causal efficacy of consciousness. And when we look at the alternatives, they are sorely lacking. They have all these fundamental problems. And I'm sort of anticipating something he's going to say here, but idealists can give a sort of argument from elimination like this. They can just say, well, look at what the alternatives are saying, and they lead to contradictions. So it just seems to be the last man standing, right? I mean, I think there's this quote from Sherlock Holmes here, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, where it's like, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. So we can give those sorts of arguments for idealism, but we give positive arguments as well.
Yeah, right.
And you have videos all about that. So we just know that's not true, what you said.
Yeah. All right, let's continue.
What they do is they talk a lot of ish about science and what other people think, and they call it magic, and they call it a make-believe worldview and all this other stuff. And then they offer their idea as the only reasonable alternative. They don't make a good case for their view. This guy did this talk at some kind of Deepal Chopra thing. Deepal Chopra loves to have this guy on because he confirms his worldview, and in a seemingly scientific kind of way. Like, he probably calls him Dr. Bernardo because he wants him to be a doctor. He wants us to seem like really legit and scientific and all this kind of stuff. Part of the reason why even I'm not really respecting a lot of authority and lots of other people aren't respecting a lot of authority is because people like this guy will get on a stage and speak with all kinds of authority. Like, he's a doctor. He'll get up on a stage and he'll say some stuff and he'll seem like,
oh my God, this guy's doing some groundbreaking, amazing stuff. He's like above and beyond what these simple, normal scientists are doing. He's doing this like way outside the box. Like, whoa, he really gets it, man. He really gets it.
and he'll talk like he really gets it because he thinks he really gets it, but he doesn't.
I want to take a step back.
Let's stick to what we know.
Conceptual analysis of everything, and just stick to what we do know.
And then tell a bunch of stories around it.
I like how he's saying that, oh, you're building stories around it. Well, again, if you actually listen to what Kastrup's saying, what he's saying is that let's only appeal to what we know, which is experience, and then use experience as the explanatory model to explain everything else. Like, that's all that Kastrup is saying, right? So I think he's just not really understanding Kastrup in this respect. And it's really, it's uncharitable, I would say. So
right. I think that's fair.
Yeah. I'm going to slow it down a little bit because I was,
okay.
Yeah, because it's hard to understand it. Okay. All right, let's continue.
You know that there is a relationship between the two, composed of atoms, force fields, and whatnot. The brain, just like the rest of the universe, is just a physical system. So what nature seems to be telling us is that if there is a first-person perspective correlated to that object we call a brain, then there is no reason not to believe, not to infer, that there is also a first-person perspective corresponding to the whole of the universe.
Why would we jump to that? Why would we jump to that? Are we just going to assume that every
I don't think he's actually read Kastrup's material. Like he has papers defending his ideas. Like he has papers sort of defending the derivation of idealism. In fact, I have a whole video called Deriving Idealism from the Basic Facts of Reality, and that's basically, I basically took Kastrup's paper and sort of made it into video format. So there are ways you could sort of derive that sort of conclusion, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and Kastrup's wording there does trip me up a little bit, but if I'm understanding him correctly, you know, when that guy asked, well, how did you get there? Why are we doing that? I think one thing Kastrup could say is monism. If we are committed to a version of monism, and we know that there's this irreducibility of the mental, and it's correlated with the brain and so forth, with this physical object, and if the universe is analogous to that, then I think what he's trying to say is that, well, it makes sense to sort of just infer that, well, yeah, that would also be mental, or would have its own mental states, but I'm not sure. But the wording of Kastrup is tripping me up a little bit. So
I agree. All right, let's continue.
Hated system is a person. Why would we jump to that? Oh, because it's an important step for him to be able to establish his dumb idea. Okay, first premise? No, I reject your first premise, which is never good. Well, if the brain is a system and it has a consciousness and it has a first person correlated to it, then any complicated system is probably a person. It's like, no. Are you going to say that your computer's a person? Are you going to want to do that?
The manipulation of symbols and the attribution of values to symbols doesn't make the computer any more conscious. This is so obvious.
No, you're not.
That there is something it is like to be the whole of the universe. No, the universe as a whole is itself the second person perspective of a first person experience at a universal level, at the level of mind at large, as I like to call it, or cosmic consciousness, as my friend Deepal Chopra likes to call it. A universal mind, so to say.
Universal mind.
Now, I'm not the only one to be open to this hypothesis. I mean, mainstream physicist Niels Nolan from the Perimeter Institute, in a book he published a couple of years ago in 2013, was quite open to this, and I'm quoting him here.
Oh, here's something. Here's somebody. I found somebody. Hey, I'm not the only one. Here's someone else. He's also he's an important person. He's a scientist. He thinks that maybe I'm right about this. There's one guy. And he's a scientist. So even though I said scientists all believe in make-believe bullshit, when it suits me and they agree with me, I'll bring out a scientist. Look, I got a scientist to prop up my thing. Are we trying to falsify our ideas to see if we stand, or desperately grasping for straws to try and find somebody who agrees with us?
He's open to the idea that the consciousness is the intrinsic aspect, or the first-person perspective of a system, as we call the brain, and that the universe as a whole may also have an intrinsic aspect. In other words, may also have first-person experience, and that we are basically living within a cosmic nervous system. And then you might say, well, Bernardo, this doesn't really add up.
What about, well, Bernardo, that's just what one man said, and you're just another one man, and just because two people said it and said, hey, I think it could be like this, doesn't really mean anything.
Well,
that's not good evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that's really very fair. I'm pretty sure there are arguments in that particular paper he's citing, you know, which does seem to be peer reviewed. I don't think he's just making a thought like, hey, well, I say this is the case. Believe me. I'm pretty sure there's arguments as well.
No, I mean, he's really not being charitable to what Kastrup's really saying, because I mean, if I were to critique Kastrup in any sort of way, I wouldn't do it in this sort of way, right? I would actually just I'll probably present like a few philosophical arguments, but I'm not going to like accuse of what this guy's doing. So
yeah, I think Kastrup's presentation here is limited too. I think Kastrup was not able to fully dissect the paper and to throw it out there. I think he was kind of just giving you a source to check out. So I think if this guy were to just look at the paper that Kastrup cited, if he started critiquing that evidence, he said, well, this evidence is very weak. I mean, that's one thing, but
yeah,
I don't know. Didn't seem very charitable. It's kind of a low blow.
Yeah.
For your philosophy, how are we 11 minutes into your presentation and you've only made one premise?
The brain is just a physical system. If there is a first-person perspective correlated to a brain, then there is no reason not to believe, not to infer that there is also a first-person perspective corresponding to the whole of the universe.
Which I've rejected because it's ridiculous. It just really seems like you either have to be like not that intelligent or like really wanting to believe to be able to buy.
Okay, but the point is that you would actually get to that sort of conclusion with an idealism. So I don't even think he's really understanding the argument being made there. But anyways,
yeah, I think it could be worded. If I'm understanding Kastrup correctly, there's many different ways that this could be worded, right? Like if we are clearly, contingent beings, and there has to be a fundamental reality, and if reality is fundamentally, experiential, which requires a subject to have that experience, then there's got to be a fundamental subject that has these experiences, which would ground contingent minds like ourselves.
Unless you're a pluralist, but I don't think pluralism is parsimonious anyway. So
yeah.
So yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
That's not 100% true. Let me step back from that for a second. There are people who definitely have not learned how to think critically. And I know that spiritual experiences can be incredibly powerful, and the narrative around them can be incredibly powerful too. So it's not like these people don't have any good reasons from a human perspective, not from an epistemic perspective, in terms of like, it makes sense that a person who had these experiences, who had heard these stories, would come to these conclusions. And it also makes sense that most of us have not been taught how science works, the scientific method, or how to be skeptical. And so it makes sense that a lot of us would be ill-prepared to be able to see through this kind of bullshit. Man, let's keep going.
Then you might say, well, Bernardo, this doesn't really add up. It doesn't look at all like a nervous system. It doesn't look like a brain. It's like discrete chunks of matter floating around in the vast distances of space without anything really connecting them. There are no synapses. There's no network in the universe. It doesn't look like a brain.
Here he's like setting himself up. Oh, you might say the universe doesn't look like a brain. No, I didn't say that. That's not what I said. I was critical of your actual logic. Now he's going to show a picture of the universe looking like another picture of a brain, and he's going to be like, see, that proves it.
Consider this. We are very tiny creatures. We are
who hasn't
the world
seen
around us, even the universe we can see with our telescopes. This is a tiny fraction of the whole of existence, of the whole of the universe. This would be equivalent to our being microscopic little people sitting on the edge of a synaptic cleft in the brain, the connection between two neurons. What would happen if we could zoom out in the universe at large and look at how the universe is formed at the largest scales? It would look like this. You see, we've computed how the universe looks like at the highest scales. And it looks like a nervous system. You see here a comparison between a simulated image of the universe at very high scales and neurons in a mouse's brain.
I could show you a similar image, like a city. Does that mean a city has consciousness? You see what I'm saying?
Okay, but I don't think he actually didn't look at the study itself, because if you actually read the study, they do get into those sort of objections. Not this specific one, but they do sort of address like type of objections that like, oh, are you sure you're not just seeing patterns and stuff? But yeah, I thought that was very uncharitable at his part, because yeah. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, at this part, I guess I don't have too much to say. I guess I kind of already made my point.
Yeah,
but I will say, I'm not personally, I'm not too committed to
being
this idea of like the brain looking like a brain, or the universe looking like this brain, or like a neuron and all that. I don't find that personally too convincing, but I think there's another part in this video where Kastrup does talk about a mathematical proof. I'm getting a little ahead of myself again, but yeah, I mean, there's math involved here. They do have a proof that they do give for some of this. And so even if you disagree, I mean, by all means disagree, but I mean, you should have a counter argument for the arguments that they're presenting. And by just saying, oh, well, this is just some random source that supports you.
The problem is that this is a complete straw man. Like this, because I don't even think he read the paper. So, I mean, it's just a complete straw man of the actual argument. So, so yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
Causation, correlation, far-sighted mishmashing. This looks like this. See? Like, this is the level of argument we're dealing with here. Oh my gosh. I find this to be pretty embarrassing. Let's continue on.
You see that the pattern of interconnections are very similar. This is not only a visual comparison. You might claim I just chose the pictures in such a way as to make them look alike, and it's a cheat, it's an illusion. But there has actually been mathematical study of these patterns of clustering and interconnection, and it has been demonstrated that indeed the universe at the largest scales seems to obey unknown laws that just make it look like and grow like a human brain.
Look, I found this over here. It's also going to prop up my thing. Look, I found 3 things to prop up my thing. See?
I found a study that shows that a
city. See, this is what I was talking about earlier. It's like you can't just do that, right? Like if he finds an argument, if he does his research, and if the argument is valid and the premises are true, it doesn't matter if you think it's propped up or something. I mean, you still have to address whether that's true or not.
Right. Yeah.
And so they give support for their claims. Again, I'm personally not too familiar with it, but I think as a critic, for him to be this critic of Kastrup, I mean, he should do his due diligence and at least address the arguments.
Right.
Instead of just this sort of ad hominem type of attack where you're just saying,
No,
oh,
that's
that's such an arbitrary source.
Right.
Doesn't really work that way.
Works and grows like a human brain. I found a study that shows that a computer works and grows like a human brain. Maybe my computer is conscious. Maybe the city is conscious.
It's like, dude, these are such pathetic, stupid arguments. This is his case for idealism, you guys.
Demonstrated, although the reasons
as above, so below. That's the level of logic we're dealing with here.
Okay, we just are able to infer that they are there because things really look similar. And then you might say, well, Bernardo, if the whole universe is one nervous system, one mind at large, one cosmic mind, one cosmic consciousness, so to say, why is it that I have a separate, tiny, disconnected inner life? Well, at the conference, I have appealed, because the attendance of the conference was composed of doctors, nurses, people involved in clinical care, healthcare in general, people with clinical experience. And I used this metaphor of dissociative identity disorder. This is a condition formerly called multiple personality disorder.
I found something. This could work to support my theory. Look, this identity disorder, that works to support my theory.
Okay,
it's like
no.
pure grasping.
It's, oh my God. He just said it was a metaphor, right? It's a way of thinking about how it could work, right? So, I mean, it's just, oh man.
Yeah, exactly. It's like some people make this objection to idealism, a higher tier objection. They try to say that, well, how can you make sense of a plurality of these contingent minds within a single fundamental mind? Or how do they all coexist together? And I mean, this goes back to, I think it was, let me see here, F.C.S. Schiller, I think is his name, where they talk about how, yeah, you can make perfect sense of this. Yeah, it's F.C.S. Schiller. Where, yeah, this analogy of dissociative identity disorder makes perfect sense of this. And that's what this is. We're just showing that this is a phenomenon that we're very aware of. This is an empirical fact that we've been studying for some time. And so there's coherence in this. And that's basically what Kastrup is saying. We can make sense of it.
Right. So, I mean, the fact that, again, he's just being very uncharitable to Kastrup here. So...
Yeah, and you can see his reactions are very emotional too, and he's getting a little upset. So,
yeah, let's continue.
For things, mishmash cluster of I'll make it work, I'll find the pieces, I'll find a scientist who will say something like it. It's building a case. There's no logic and evidence here. This is pure storytelling. Oh, I found something that looks like it could work. I'll take that idea and then just assert that that's how the universe works, because look here, that's how this works.
In which the patient develops multiple personalities, dissociated personalities, that are also called alters. And these dissociated personalities often are not even aware of each other. And when they are, they often don't like each other and they want to hurt or kill each other. They're quite dissociated, quite separate. They don't share the same memories. They don't share the same preferences, the same goals. They're highly dissociated in memories and preferences. And yet they are unquestionably all part of the same psyche, of the same person. Now, these alters, they take turns in time controlling the person, so to say. Now, space-time is an integrated unit, and an integrated entity, as we know, since Einstein, is the general theory of relativity. So it is entirely conceivable that there might be alters in space as well, alters in space-time. And the hypothesis they want to put forward to you is that what we call life is a dissociative process in this universal consciousness, in this universal mind at large, just like dissociative identity disorder. Each living creature is an alter, a dissociated personality with its own memories of mind at large. And living bodies, metabolism, biology, is just the image of these dissociated alters of mind at large, of this cosmic consciousness. To give you some intuition about this, let's make a comparison here. We are able today to, with a person with dissociative identity disorder, under a functional brain scanner, an fMRI, we are able to identify in the person's brain these neural processes that are correlated with the dissociative identity of the person, with the dissociation of multiple personalities in the person. So the neural processes are the image of these dissociated alters in the person's brain. This is established today.
But this is established today. No. This is pure assertion, my dude. You have established nothing.
Okay, no, it's so bad. Oh man. He's literally denying. This guy's literally denying the evidence of a dissociative identity disorder. Like, he's literally denying this. Yeah,
I think he's missing the point.
Yeah,
he thinks he's just like, oh, well, here's this random thing, here's this random that, and no, he's basically Kastrup is anticipating objections. Right? He's not really familiar with the debate that's been happening in the past. Some of this, to give a little bit of the history, back to the heart problem, right? We're trying to account for how you get human and animal consciousness. And so the panpsychist tries to say there's little minds that come together, and we argue that doesn't work as the combination problem. So the idealist has their own version where we have a single fundamental mind that sort of decombines into these other minds. And
right, and the question is whether or not idealism has any hard problems itself, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like it does, right? And that's the whole point that Kastrup was trying to make, where because we have empirical evidence of this dissociative identity disorder actually occurring in nature, then it seems more likely that idealism can better explain, why we ourselves exist, and for example, so yeah, it's just I just found it hilarious when he completely denied the evidence for DID. Oh man, that was bad. So
yeah, he just fundamentally misses the point.
Yeah. All right, let's go.
What he's actually talking about here is that this is a fact about multiple personality disorder. But he keeps on trying to associate things that are established facts or actual science, and the fact that they're established or that they're science, with his theory being true. Just because multiple personality disorder is real and true doesn't mean that the universe has it. This logic is basically something like, if one thing happens on one level, we should see it happening with everything on every level. And that's just crazy. Like, there's no reason to think that's true. Making reference to things that are proven or known in your argument makes your argument seem like it's good, but the logic around how he comes to his conclusion isn't good, so this premise doesn't matter. In general, I think that there's something manipulative about what he's doing here, because this is exactly the kind of thing that's confusing and convincing to people who don't follow logic well. Basically, if you call yourself a doctor and you speak with authority around something and you say words like, this is well established, and you make assertive claims, people start to believe what you say, even if it's technically true and unrelated to your point that the thing that you're saying is so well established. Just the fact that you're saying that a factor of what you're talking about is so well established in your talk and saying this is absurd and this is so obvious and all these kinds of things, there's a lot of very manipulative speech in this thing, and it's done in a way that seems safe and there's plausible deniability. Like, if you go back and look at what he actually said, it's technically true, but it's just manipulative language with plausible deniability. And that's basically a lot of what Bernardo is doing. That's kind of his whole shtick.
We are able to identify in the person's brain his neuroprocesses, your neuroprocesses that are correlated with the dissociative identity of the person, with the dissociation of multiple personalities in the person. So these neuroprocesses are the image of these dissociated alters in the person's brain. This is established today. Now, if the universe at large is a kind of brain, is the second-person perspective of a universal first-person inner life, first-person experience, set of experiences, then it is entirely logical that if mind at large has dissociative identity disorder, we should also be able to find the images of the dissociative processes in mind at large. And my contention is that we can find them. They're us. You're looking at one right now. I am the image of a dissociative process in mind at large.
So what is the image of a dissociated process in my computer? If I can find one, does that prove it has a...
Oh my God, that's not the point, bro.
That's terrible. And Kastrup would not say computers are conscious. I'm pretty sure he'd be the first person to say that they're not.
I know.
Like, if you had done a bit of background in Kastrup, you'd know that.
I know. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, he's completely misunderstanding. Because Kastrup would not say that a computer is a dissociated alter. He specifically says, and that's the thing, Kastrup specifically says that life is a dissociated alter. He's not going to say that a computer is one, right? So he's just, oh my God, it's ridiculous. But anyways, let's continue.
Personality, that it's a being in itself. What about a mind at large in a system like a forest? All of its trees are dissociated alters and it's a larger being. It's like where are you drawing up the lines of things? This is just crazy. It's just like, well, how can we make a scientific sounding case for Hinduism where it's like, we'll never say Hinduism, we'll never say enlightenment, we'll never say spirit.
The S word, which I try to avoid.
We'll talk about mind at large instead of the grounded being, and we'll talk about dissociated identities instead of saying archetypes in the mind of God, or that we're all just versions of God. I mean, there you go. Now we're vibing with the whole New Age community here. They're like,
oh yes, we love to just grab things that work to support our worldview and cram them in there. Look, here's another doctor-looking sounding guy.
Which you can use, by the way. I mean, Kastrup even says that you could. I know I myself use Kastrup's sort of view to help me understand my own worldview. But that's, who cares? Like, it doesn't really matter.
There's going to be some overlap here and there.
No, right? Yeah. So that's the whole issue. Is just because there's some overlap does not mean that Kastrup's view is going to necessarily entail some New Age stuff. So yeah, let's continue.
Who is saying something that I already agree with, who will support the things that I already want to believe in. Let's definitely plug him in.
This dude is considered to be one of the serious, mature philosophers who has a good argument and good case, a rational case for idealism, and it's pure storytelling.
If the whole universe is one nervous system, one mind at large, one cosmic mind, one cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, well, if ifs and buts was candies and nuts, we all have a Merry Christmas. Tell them that.
How lame is this? Let's keep going.
You are the image of another dissociative process of mind at large. A mosquito of the dissociative processes in mind at large. Plants and vegetables, they may be images of the beginning of this dissociation, the early stages, not yet complete, but the beginning of the dissociation. This is what life is, the image of dissociative processes in mind at large.
These people, they always end up arguing, God has multiple personalities and he loves to masturbate. But the world was conceived in love, you guys. The world has meaning and purpose. It's like, oh my God, you're trying to do this because you think it's beautiful and it has more value, but you're arguing that God has multiple personalities, and that's the point of reality. This is not a beautiful, meaningful thing. Not only is it wrong and disempowering, it's actually stupid when you think about the beauty that these people are trying to maintain with their stupid ideas. People don't want to believe that they're just another part of the universe. They're just, they desperately want to believe there's something more.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'll get a quick comment. Yeah, I don't think anyone's trying to say this is like, if anyone says it's aesthetic or anything like that, which I don't hear anyone saying, I think they would be talking about some sort of theoretical virtue in some way, right? They're saying that it's simple, it's elegant in that sense, and that's something that's actually good for investigations. That's what you do in abductive arguments. You want to find the one that is the simplest, that assumes the least and explains the most. And we look for elegance in mathematics and physics and stuff like that. So if we have an elegant metaphysical worldview in that sense, and not in the sense that it's pretty or beautiful, but in the sense that it has all those virtues, then that's a good thing. That would be virtuous. So that's not a problem. And this whole thing about multiple personality disorder, that, yeah, he's right, that just because it's coherent doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
But that's where Kastrup does give his arguments for that. He does give arguments that there is this universal mind, and he does give arguments that, yes, we are dissociated, and the process that would explain this best would be dissociation. And this video, by the way, I do want to note, this isn't even Kastrup's final form. I mean, this was, I think, made before.
This was made like, I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, I think it was before his PhD in philosophy of mind.
Yeah.
Kastrup has gotten a lot more sophisticated over the years. He's developed his arguments a lot more. I mean, there's a whole video where he goes over his dissertation. So, I mean, if he could have gone after a video by Kastrup where he gives a lot more arguments and a lot more detail. So it's interesting that he picked this video.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
But there's something else. There's a greater plan. There's a greater meaning. It's like, no, actually, there's no good reasons or evidence to think that. Part of growing up is just realizing that these fairy tales and these mythologies about higher purpose and some ultimate plan or some ultimate being, it's just stories because people can't cope with life. They can't cope with the fact that they're going to die, that their life isn't part of some kind of plan or doesn't have any kind of purpose except for the purposes that we make for ourselves. But you know what? It's coming to grips with this adult real world ish that actually makes you start to be a more responsible, worthwhile, and awake person. He's kind of grasping real hard to this crutch and the security blanket so that way he can feel like everything's okay.
Okay, I just want to point out that Kastrup is actually not a theist in the technical sense. So like, even if he may, I mean, I shouldn't say that. Maybe he does believe in God, but his version of God is not the religious type of God that you're gonna pray to, you know. So that, I mean, that's just a complete misunderstanding of at least Kastrup's view. But anyways, let's continue.
Meaningful. We're not just stuff, you guys. One day we're going to return home. We're going to return to our source. Mommy and daddy will love us. The universe is conceived in love. Everything's good, you guys. We're not just some accident. We're not just stuff. We're not just out here on a rock floating endlessly through space. It's all meaningful. It's all for a purpose. It's all for a great plan.
That being the reason why we think that we are separate from the rest of the universe, that we have our separate, private, inner lives. We are simply dissociated. We are authors of mind at large.
And that makes sense to an extent because we know we're connected and we forget that we're connected and we act as though we're not connected, right? So it's like this resonates really well with a lot of the Buddhist metaphors, and a lot of the Buddhist metaphors are true. They resonate really well with like the existentialism, deconstructing kind of metaphors, where it's like there is an important truth in this. But then these storytellers come and they use these experiences or correlate these experiences to these large conclusions that are just like a reach on top of a leap, on top of an assertion, like just ridiculous. Let's continue.
According to this view, if I look out to the inanimate universe around me, composed of rocks and moons and stars and nebulae and galaxy clusters, all of that are images of non-dissociated processes of mind at large, as perceived by me, an alter of mind at large. They are indeed outside me as an alter. They are outside my dissociated complex of mind at large, but they are not outside mind itself. They are not outside consciousness. When we say that there is a world outside, it means outside the alter, not outside mind itself.
Well, can you reassociate and then disappear? Do that and I'll be impressed. This brings it back to that question of, okay, it's not falsifiable. Okay, well, what's the practical value of it? Hey, you think you're a dissociated alter?
Why would we expect there to be this appearing and reappearing?
Yeah, that's, I know. I've had that objection plenty of times, and I don't understand like why. Because I think about it, if modism is true, and if everything is mind, then of course when you die, you're not gonna like your body's not gonna disappear, right? Because I don't know, it's just ridiculous.
I don't know. I'm just that's funny. That's the first time I've actually heard that objection, and I'm just thinking of why one would expect that. And if they can give me a reason, I mean, I'll hear them out. If they can meet their burden of proof and tell me that, well, if this is the case, then alter should be appearing and reappearing and so forth. I mean, then I could see how that'd be a problem, but I'm not seeing any reason to believe that, so I don't see a problem.
Yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
Why don't you show me what it's like to actually reintegrate or associate with something, and let's see what that actually looks like. Oh, you can't? Okay, so how is it helpful to know that? Oh, it's not? Okay. What's the point of all this? The goal is what? To wake up as God, but still you'll always be a dissociated alter. How is there ever a real awakening in this context? Is it even possible? Or what does that mean? How come you always stay dissociated? Or does he think that if you fully awaken that you disappear? How is this helpful or good or true? It's so stupid.
There's no need
I got a question. Wait, yeah, one thing. Okay, so I mean, you could ask that question for just about anybody, right? I mean, if this is, let's assume physicalism. What's the point of all this? Right? If it's dualism, what's the point of all this?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just another question. That's just some other existential question. Idealists could have their own answer to that.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, especially if they're more religious, there could be answers to that. A Christian could say something to that. But Kastrup is a bit more neutral on that.
It's not, yeah. I mean, I have heard of him in interviews, and I think from his perspective, his idea is basically that, and I could be wrong here, so if I get this wrong, just forgive me, Kastrup, if you're watching this. But basically, his idea is that we all want to basically, we're not supposed to be dissociated alters. We're still all supposed to be one mind, one universal consciousness. And so when you die, they're going to have like this bliss, right? That could be an answer that one can give from a Kastrupian perspective, right? But that's a different issue than the theory itself.
Right.
So the theory, you have to distinguish between the theory and the implication. So if the implications of a theory are that we're all going to become one with, universal consciousness or whatever, then that's it. Like who cares if if it's going to bring you bliss. Like, that's not going to tell you anything about whether or not the theory is actually true or false. So, and then I guess one last thing is pessimistic idealism pointing this out, where I guess works have no value because they can't be falsified. Yeah, exactly. Like, just because something can't be falsified in a strong sense does not mean that it has no value, right? So yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
There's no need to postulate a world outside of mentality because everything exists in God's mind. So basically, this is just a linguistic trick, an argumentative chess move, like I was talking about before. Like, science isn't real. Okay, so everything's happening in mind, so there's no world outside of mind.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Ridiculous. Yeah, I think at one point he says that a Kastrup or idealist was saying reality doesn't exist. And
yeah, that's
just patently.
It's so bad.
Yeah. Just to be clear for the audience, we idealists clearly believe that reality is real. We just identify reality as mental.
Right. All right. Let's continue.
These are just like broad strokes, like large leaps of logic and straight assertions that allow him to dismiss huge aspects of reality and science. Oh, we don't need to listen to science. That's just dogma. Oh, we don't need to postulate a world outside of mind. So all that.
Okay, so I guess we can get into the purpose of science, and like why is it that science is, I wouldn't say it's useless, but it's not really relevant to the context of ontology. And that's because science doesn't really speak about ontological claims, right? So science is only going to tell you what things do. It's not going to actually tell you what the fundamental nature of what things are, right? So it's not like idealists are not going to deny science, right? Because science is going to tell you what matter does, but it's not going to tell you what matter actually is, right? And so that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, and so this is an attack on science, by the way.
Yeah,
it's just we understand the proper role of science, and that's actually good to restrict the scope of science because we want to be able to meaningfully distinguish between science and pseudoscience. If we broaden the scope of science too much and just let anything go, it's empirical, you're not going to get something that's very critical. So we want science to be critical and skeptical, and so that means we're only going to use it for certain jobs. And so metaphysics and physics are two different fields, and they need to be used appropriately.
Right. All right, let's continue.
That stuff is just, like Christians who are just like,
oh, no, evolution's not true. You've never seen evolution. Evolution doesn't happen.
This is the level of argument. Name calling and storytelling. That's all this is. There's no valid logic. I don't think I've agreed with any of his points, nor does he have any evidence, nor does he ever try to falsify any of it. It's a joke. A person who talks like this in public, if they are a doctor, should have their doctors revoked. Their school should disavow what they say publicly.
When I see other living creatures, other human beings, cows, dogs, cats, flies, plants, algae, bacteria, I am seeing the image of other dissociated processes of mind at large. All non-dissociated processes in mind at large. In other words, they inanimate the universe are just the images of subjective experiences. They are a second-person perspective of experience, of first-person experience. And the views of an author, my experiences of the world and other living beings, they are also subjective perspectives, as far as I can know. Subjectivity is the only carrier of my reality that I can ever know.
So science is out because, hey, that's just a person's subjective experience. Forget about peer review and our ability to develop technology over time because we do actually know objective facts about how the world around us works in a consistent and coherent way. No, it's all just someone's subjective perspective.
Okay, no, this is
nobody's rejecting science. Yeah, nobody's rejecting science at all.
Yeah, and I think he's also conflating Kastrup's idealism with a sort of subjective idealism. We're not saying that reality is subjective, right? So that's another important point to make, right?
Yeah, I think Kastrup is comfortable identifying himself as a sort of objective idealist, or he also calls it analytic idealism.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I also want to point out, and this is what Jacob Power said, Kastrup's video isn't an argumentative video. So Kastrup is not actually arguing for idealism specifically. He's actually just explaining what his view is. So that's another important thing I want to point out to people. And so
that is a very good point to bring up. Yeah. Kastrup, even the title of it is saying here's just my small theory of everything.
Right.
And Long tries to, he posted that clip earlier of the guy saying if, as if making fun of, if idealism. Well, yeah, I mean, he's just describing what the view is, right? And the implications of it. So
right. Yeah. So let's continue.
Trust it, but all my logical jumps and leaps, that is like solid.
So everything is then subjectivity. Everything is mentation.
Everything's subjectivity.
Dissociation.
Upper left quadrant reductionism. Hey, we don't need.
Okay, that's just, again, he's just misunderstanding objective versus subjective idealism. But anyways,
these exterior quadrants. Yeah, maybe we can even get rid of the lower left quadrant too. It's all just God, all mind at large, everything's subjectivity. This is not an integral view, people. Why would you want this? Why would you want this as a worldview? I don't get it. I ask, why would you want this? Because it's clear to me that he wants this to be true. This is not the best, most reasonable theory there is to be had. He must want this, but I don't understand.
Okay, that's actually false. He's actually said in multiple interviews that if he could choose which worldview would true, he want to be a physicalist because he doesn't actually have to worry about an afterlife or anything.
Yeah,
so I just want to point that out.
As a physicalist, It was just how he grew up. That's his upbringing.
Right. So,
well, I guess he was raised in, I guess one of his parents was Catholic, but just his academic background and where he researched, there was always a physicalist background, and it wasn't really questioned.
Yeah, because I mean, if you listen to his interviews, it's like, well, he actually does say that if he actually would want physicalism to be true, because when you die, you don't have to experience anything. Like, you don't have to really worry about anything after that, right? So
yeah.
That's
By the way,
it's just,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's just, yeah, I just want to point out, it's just completely false that Kastrup wants idealism to be true. It doesn't seem like, at least given his interviews, he wants it to be true. So
no, yeah, there are arguments he gives for all of it.
Yeah.
It doesn't just seem to be some desire. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to Jacob Power and Pessimistic Idealism. Those are two great channels, by the way, for the audience. If you're hearing this, check out their videos. They're very informative.
Yeah, and then I guess one last point with regards to science: the method, conclusions, and presuppositions of contemporary scientific enterprise are anti-holistic and are legitimate when kept as relative to their selective. Exactly, like that's sort of the whole point. But yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
He wants this because it's so unhelpful and stupid, and it makes life so pointless. Basically, the goal of life is to disappear with these views. Buddhism too. Stop the ride. I want off. I want to disappear. I want to cease to be. I want to kill my ego. I don't like that at all. I think that's super unhealthy. So not only wrong, not only stupid, not only completely unfounded, but also psychologically problematic and unhealthy. So yeah, not a big fan.
And if there is no universe outside consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness just disappears. It melts away like butter under the sun.
Hey, if there's no universe outside of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness just disappears. That's how we deal with these things. We just pretend like, hey, if reality doesn't exist, then we don't have to deal with problems.
Is this the part where he said that reality doesn't exist?
Yeah.
Oh, man. This is so bad. Oh, man.
Sad.
Okay, I guess I should clarify. So the reason why this is a bad objection is because idealism is a theory of reality. So we're not saying that reality doesn't exist. What we're saying is that reality is just experience. Reality is consciousness, right? And what we're going to say is that there's no reality beyond experience. There's no reality beyond consciousness, right? But that's because that's given the theory. So given the theory, reality is experience. However, we're not saying that reality doesn't exist, right? So
exactly.
So yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
Of science, and we can just sweep all that under the rug and ignore it. No problem. It's just easier. I mean, if only you exist and there's really no landlord, you can solve that landlord problem and just not pay him. There is no spoon. That's going to work real well, you know?
Because the hard problem arises from, one, inferring a universe outside consciousness, which is an abstraction of consciousness itself, and then trying to explain consciousness from that abstraction of consciousness. This will never work. We are just chasing our own tails at light speed. But if all there is consciousness, then consciousness is the ontological primitive, and the entirety of reality can be explained as just modulations, excitations, vibrations of consciousness alone.
Okay, well, let's stop there. Here we are 21 minutes into your talk, and you're saying, well, if consciousness is the ontological primitive, why don't you make a case for that?
If ifs and buts was candy.
He does.
He does, exactly.
He does. Oh man, it's funny. But
nuts. We all have a Merry Christmas.
Where is your logical case for that? It's not impossible that one might come to this conclusion, but you have done none of the steps to get us to this conclusion. You haven't started.
Okay, he hasn't like watched any of his videos. He's, oh my god, it's bad.
Yeah, Kastrup has all these books and
he has a blog for crying out loud.
He has his own website. I mean, he gives all of these arguments.
Like, it's not like he's just presenting this theory and that's it. Like, he actually has arguments to support his theory.
I guess the idea of the world, I'd recommend him. He could read The Idea of the World for his most recent and comprehensive book, where he gives basically his major case for it. So I'd recommend reading that, Mr. Long.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, it's just completely false that he doesn't have arguments for that. Anyway, let's continue.
From I think, therefore I am, I don't know what's going on in this universe, I don't know what is happening, to establishing logic and reason and being able to look around the world or in your consciousness or with whatever tools you have to be able to come to conclusions about the nature of reality, to be able to understand your experience in that context, to be able to prove the conclusion that consciousness is the ontological primary. You have to actually get to that to establish that. You have to actually make a case for that. You don't just get to start with that as an assumption. We've seen no case for that. We've seen him say
the brain is just a physical system. If there is a first-person perspective correlated to the brain, and there is no reason not to believe, not to infer, that there is also a first-person perspective corresponding to the whole of the universe.
Well, if complicated systems are a person, then every complicated system should be a person, which is
okay. That's somebody saying. That's a complete straw man. Like, again, he says that life is a dissociative process. He's not saying that every complicated system is a dissociative process.
Kastrup is not a panpsychist.
Yeah.
Kastrup has made it clear he's not a panpsychist.
So, oh man, let's continue.
Premise. That's your argument for how consciousness is the ontological primary? Stupid first premise like this?
The idea of a world outside me arising from dissociation in consciousness, not from a world outside consciousness. You may ask, well, these ideas sound kind of new agey and crazy and unreasonable and non-scientific, but nothing could be further from the truth.
Nothing
There
could
has
be
been a paper published in Nature magazine, you can see here on the top.
Here's something. I found one. Here's a scientist who thinks something that looks like what I'm saying. See, it's scientific, you guys. Look, there was a time when a scientist said something in a journal about this, sort of, probably, maybe, kind of, and I found a sentence in there that really supports what I think. My positive case for emergentism. It's like, well, how do we know that there are other minds? Well, how do we know that peer review works? It's like, well, we proved that it works. We have the proof that it works. And if it didn't work, science...
Whoa. Dang.
Okay, well, proof. Okay, I don't know if I need to let him speak a bit more here, because there's a couple things I want to say about emergence. Yeah, let's see what he says real fast.
Wouldn't work. Your computer wouldn't work. Your TV wouldn't work, because reality doesn't work in a consistent and objective kind of way. Like, there's a case that I can make where I can say, look, we tried to debunk it. We tried to prove it wrong, but it proves to be true. It stands up over and over again. And that's how you're able to have a cell phone, a TV, and we were able to put a man on the moon. Where is Bernardo's case that says something like that? Where's Bernardo's man?
Okay, yeah, so I guess I'll just say this before I forget everything. When we talk about emergence, right, we already went over the distinction between weak and strong.
Yeah.
Okay, he keeps talking about this strong emergence as if this is okay and this is acceptable. This is actually quite controversial. Here's a quote from Mark Bedau here. A strong emergence is uncomfortably like magic. How does an irreducible but supervenient downward causal power arise, since by definition it cannot be due to the aggregation of the micro-level potentialities? Such causal powers would be quite unlike anything within our scientific ken. This not only indicates how they will discomfort reasonable forms of materialism, their mysteriousness will only heighten the traditional worry that emergence entails illegitimately getting something from nothing. And there's one more quote I'd like to read here from David Scribina. This is from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, their entry on panpsychism. The basic problem is this. Emergence seems at first glance to be a reasonable enough idea, but when pressed for details, it comes up sorely lacking. In fact, emergence of mind is very difficult to sensibly explain. Mind is not like five-fingeredness or warm-bloodedness. These things, which clearly did emerge, weakly emerge, I should say, are ontologically unlike mind. They are simply reconfigurations of existing physical matter, whereas mind is of a different ontological order. It is too fundamental an aspect of existence to be comparable to ordinary biological structural features. So he's really making these false analogies here. He's conflating weak and strong emergence. If we're talking about strong emergence, this is something that's very controversial in the sciences and across many different fields. Many argue that it's, it doesn't exist, or that if it doesn't exist, it's incredibly unparsimonious and unreasonable. It comes off like 1 + 1 = 3. It's when you really get down to and there's just no details. So this isn't just an appeal to the unknown, like, oh, we just can't figure it out. It's just too difficult for us. It's just when you actually hear what they're saying, it's just 1 + 1 = 3, basically. And it really doesn't.
It doesn't explain. Yeah, it doesn't actually explain consciousness at all. So yeah. All right, let's continue.
Man on the moon. What has his theory contributed?
Okay. Again, this is conflating physicalism with science. Okay, like, oh my God, just because we have used science to build, build nuclear weapons and bring someone to the moon, right? That's not going to show that actually physicalism is true, because that's perfectly consistent with idealism. Because again, science can only tell you what matter does. It's not going to actually tell you what the ontological nature, what matter actually is. Because on Kastrup's theory on idealism, matter is the non-dissociated. It's basically non-dissociated mental activity, right? Just as a physicalist would say that the physical world is the activity of mindless matter, the idealist is going to say that the world is the activity of mind, right? So that's perfectly consistent with what the advances of science and what science has done. So
yeah, and furthermore, I mean, I'm not saying quantum physics supports idealism. I don't make those arguments, but the founders of quantum physics were incredibly idealistic, and it does seem like their sort of perspective and their philosophy did sort of guide them in their theorizing and lead them to think in new and creative ways. So, I mean, one of the most successful theories in physics there, quantum physics, I mean, is, propped up by a lot of these people who were idealists. So, I mean, there's lots of, great idealist scientists out there in the world that contributed much to science, and idealism used to be the dominant view for many years.
Oh, right.
Before the 20th century, the first centuries before that were very idealistic. So
yeah,
he just doesn't know his history.
All right, let's continue.
Where it's like, oh, you think reality works in this kind of way? Well, let me show you how I can prove it. Empty claims, storytelling. He's putting up his flimsy worldview based on nothing, some things that he could grab and some far-sighted mishmashing and bad logic. And he's putting that up against what hundreds of thousands of people have built together through a rigorous process over hundreds of years. Our best theories.
Okay, but that's not physicalism, dude. It's like, oh my God. Anyways, let's...
That have had people attacking them and criticizing them from every angle, and still they stand up and rise to the top over a huge, long process. And he wants to put his flimsy little stupid hypothesis up against the most valid theories that work across multiple scientific disciplines.
Okay, but that's not, again, like as we pointed out, that scientific theories that's not physicalism, because a scientific theory is not going to tell you the ontological nature of matter. So
yeah, and they actually don't work across multiple disciplines, right?
Yeah.
When you talk about biological and chemical phenomena in terms of physics, I mean, there's some success there, but when we get into psychology and sociology, we really can't quite reduce that. And I think that's what he was even trying to argue earlier in the video at one point. So I'm not sure where he really stands anymore, but yeah, actually, it doesn't carry over across multiple fields.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a show. Look, I found a scientist. Shut up, man.
Volume 436 in July 2005, 10 years ago almost.
Had to dig back through the records, through the archives for over 10 years to find something that looked like it would prop up my theory, and had to ignore so many arguments to the contrary to find something that supports what I'd really like to believe, so I can grab this needle out of a haystack to make what I'd like to think seem scientific by saying, look, I found a scientist who said something like that. It's so ridiculous.
Published by Professor Richard Henry from Johns Hopkins University, in which he basically bit the bullet and he said the universe is entirely mental.
He bites the bullet. It's a secret. Everyone in the scientific world, they all know it's true. They just don't want to bite the bullet and admit it.
Okay, but scientists are not concerned with metaphysics. So again, this is a complete misunderstanding of... Anyways.
Manipulative, dishonest language. This guy, Bernardo, he is a con man. He might be a philosophical con man, but he is a con man. His speech is manipulative. He has no good points. This is not a logic-based argument.
Okay, he's not trying to make an argument, bro. Oh my God. This is not an argumentative video, right? It's a video explaining his view. So, oh man, this is just ridiculous. But I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but
yeah, for now we'll see what more he has to say. Eventually, he starts talking a bit more about Deepal Chopra.
Okay,
but we'll see what else he has to say.
Yeah.
For what he would like to believe based on what he can scrounge up. This is not scientific. This is not rational. This is storytelling propped up by things that he could find.
And he didn't say that because of philosophical preferences or philosophical rationale. He was just aware of experiments in physics that seemed to be leading to this conclusion. Let me explain this a bit. If the universe were indeed outside of consciousness, this would have certain implications that could be tested in laboratory experiments. And they have been tested. The results contradict this idea that things exist independent of our conscious observation of them. And this is what motivated Professor Henry to arrive at this conclusion. He went further, even said that many physicists try to go around this implication of the experiments, and they try to find very complicated, tortuous theories to save this idea of a universe outside consciousness. And what he says is that this is counterproductive. It doesn't generate any new physics. It just perpetuates the illusion of a universe outside consciousness. And he finishes his paper in a quite spectacular way. He even uses the S word, which I tried to avoid.
He tries to avoid using the S word spirit because he doesn't want it to become so clear that what he's selling is dressed up scientific looking spirituality. And what is the great contribution that this idea that the world is all mental has contributed to physics? Where are the evidence of those?
Okay, but it's not oh my God, this is I don't know how many times I have to say it, but again, metaphysics and science are completely separate topics, right? Like there's nothing in physicalism that's going to contribute to science, right? Because science does not deal with questions of metaphysics, right? So
yeah, you can be a substance dualist and still be a scientist,
right?
And perform all these things.
It's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Contributions. You notice that he says, "Oh, this has all been debunked." Where? Based on what? If that's the case, why didn't
I don't think he actually said that. So again, it's a complete misunderstanding. But
how is it that we're 23 minutes in, like towards the end of your talk, you're saying that there's all this evidence in that debunks the stuff, and yet you're just now telling us? I don't understand. He doesn't want to get into it because he knows, like this guy said, that scientists don't agree with that fish. And this guy is probably has a fringe opinion too, who's also influenced by the same Eastern idealistic sources that Bernardo is probably influenced by. These aren't original ideas to any of these guys. So the fact that he could find one other scientific paper that thinks some of this stuff and has these ideas probably on the back of a bad interpretation of quantum physics, they're like, oh, see, that disproves materialism. No, it doesn't. It just shows that things work different on a lower scale of reality. It doesn't debunk Newtonian physics or anything like that. Let's continue.
But he basically concludes the universe is immaterial in the sense of not being outside consciousness, not being outside mind. He beats that bullet fully. Now, this was 10 years ago. In the meantime, in the last 10 years, many more experiments in physics have been done, trying to find those things that would be consistent with the idea of a universe outside consciousness at the microscopic level. And just to show some references to you, I'm not going to go through these. I just want to mention them. At least 4 new papers, one only a few weeks ago in 2015 by Manning and et al., in which they tested those things, and they realized they can't confirm again that the universe doesn't behave in the way one would expect it to behave if it indeed were outside consciousness.
There's no details here. These are claims, and he's saying, here, you can go look them up. Here's the sources. And he's pretty much banking on the fact that you won't go look any of these things up. Yeah, this is all non-local quantum stuff.
So this is actually where I want to take a moment and talk about Deepal Chopra. Remember,
you want to go over Deepak or no?
Yeah, it's interesting that he didn't look up those papers. He's like, he's banking on you not looking them up. I'm like, well, why didn't you look them up? I mean,
right.
If you're trying to be critical of them.
You want to go?
Yeah, I guess I already made that point already. But yeah, we can look over a bit of this. I'm not too, because I don't know, it gets into a bit about quantum physics and idealism.
Yeah.
And I'm not too committed to that, but we can still show where mistakes are made on either side.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we can finish stuff.
All right.
Bernardo came out with this talk at a conference hosted by Deepak Chopra. So let's just rewind back to 2010, when Deepak Chopra tried to bring up a lot of these ideas, especially related to quantum physics, in a room with a bunch of actual scientists.
In reference to Sam Harris, he said, don't go the way of quantum physics. I think I'm going to have to say that science is now in a process of overthrowing the superstition of materialism. That everything that we call matter comes from something that is not material. That the essential nature of the physical world is that it's not physical. That the essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff. Call it what you will. And science also tells us, and if there are any scientists who want to disagree with them, please come up during the question and answer session. Science tells us that nature is a discontinuity, that it's an on-off phenomenon. That there are gaps between every two ons, where you find a field of possibilities, a field of pure potentiality. Science doesn't call it God. But what is God if not the immeasurable potential of all that was, all that is, and all that will be? Science also tells us that it's a field of non-locality, where everything is correlated with everything else. My adversaries are going to point out, no, everything God is explained by neurology.
So I guess just one thing I want to point out, and this is probably my biggest criticism of someone like Deepak, which is there's a lot of different interpretations of quantum mechanics. So while what he's saying might be true in certain interpretations, it's not going to be true in others, right? So that's an important thing I want to point out, and that's why I don't really like those arguments, because it's going to really depend on how you view quantum mechanics. But yeah.
Well, I hope today, Michael, that you will convert from a skeptic to a neuroskeptic, because your science is really frozen in the dungeons of conservatism and in the dungeons of orthodoxy. Today, science tells us that the essential nature of reality is non-local correlation. Everything is connected to everything else. That there's hidden creativity. There are quantum leaps of creativity. That there's something called the observer effect, where intention orchestrates space-time events, which we then measure as movement and motion and energy and matter. We can have a personal relationship with this intelligence, because we have a consciousness that is part of the sea of consciousness. And all you have to do is understand the principles of science and understand that you have within you the resources to intuitively grasp this mystery. But one of the things we have to do today, my friends at Caltech, you have given us this opportunity, that you have to stop being the jihadists and the Vatican of conservative and orthodox science, which is not relevant anymore.
You asked what I meant by woo-woo. That is the very embodiment of woo-woo. He said, stringing together a rapid patter, a bunch of scientific sounding words sprinkled in with some spiritual new age words, doesn't mean anything.
I hope that scientists here in this audience.
By the way, scientists are not jihadists here. This is Caltech. We're not jihadists. That was really very unspiritual of you. This non-local quantum effects are all connected. No, this is not true. When quantum physicists talk about non-locality and the interconnectedness of things, they're talking about things at the quantum level. And there's no reason to think that it's active at the level of the brain. When you talk about the observer effect and the uncertainty principle, this is how subatomic particles are altered by looking at them, by bombarding them with light, for example, because they're so small. And so you look at it or you don't look at it, that changes the nature of what you're looking at. But the moon is really there whether you look at it or not. It doesn't apply to the macro world. In the absence of
Okay, well, that's actually false. It does apply to macro world, but
yeah, that's because I'm not too familiar with this, but if I'm not mistaken, they say the macro world is made up of that quantum world, and I think they do try to cite arguments or papers. I mean,
and so Michael Shermer is so Michael Shermer is definitely wrong there. It does apply to macro world, but I would also say that Deepak Chopra, I think his biggest problem is again just what I pointed out before with the different interpretations, right? So while what he might be saying is true in a certain context, it's not true, and depending on which view you hold, right? So I just want to point that out to the audience. Anyways, let's continue.
This entity, the moon, remains a radically ambiguous and ceaselessly flowing quantum soup. That you have to have.
No, yeah, I would do the same thing. Yeah, that sounds kind of weird. I'm not gonna lie, that one's just facepalm, but yeah.
Conscious being.
Yes. Listen to the sounds in the room.
Well, I guess Bernardo's moon landing is out then.
The deeper point here, and this is where the whole style and content of what you're saying is so deeply unscientific, is that there's not a physicist sitting on the stage right now. Okay, I would never be tempted to lecture a room full of 1,000 people at Caltech about physics. I'm not a physicist. You're not a physicist. And basically every sentence demonstrates that you speak on the subject. Now, please don't take this as ad hominem, but what you do and what many people who try to invoke spooky physics do in the service of propping up their religious and new age intuitions is that they think that because quantum mechanics is spooky and difficult to understand, and because what you're saying is spooky and difficult to understand, they must somehow be related, or they must somehow be mutually supportive. And that's fundamentally not true. They're arrived at by completely different methodologies and ways of thinking and criteria of discursive evidence. I've studied with great mystics. I've met great meditation masters who spent 20 years in caves perfecting the kinds of techniques of meditation that you would adopt or recommend. They don't know a damn thing about physics. And they're not interested, for the most part, in physics. And there's nothing about sitting in a cave and, granted, having incredibly useful and even normative experiences and transforming your way of life and transforming your moment perception of the world. There's nothing about that project that makes you a theoretical physicist. These are completely different language games, and you have just merged them together in a very unprincipled way. This is a game. It's a game that is designed for export to people who don't know much science and don't know how science is done. You're not a theoretical physicist. The way science is done,
and I invite physicists in this audience to actually address this.
Okay, so a theoretical physicist will be comfortable talking with real confidence in a very narrow band of his expertise, and he will be exquisitely sensitive to the fact that whenever he opens his mouth in a room like this, he is guaranteed to be speaking in front of half a dozen people who know more on any given issue than he does. The great irony of the popular conception of science as arrogant is that when you go to a scientific meeting, you're as likely to see real arrogance as you're likely to see nudity. People are constantly offering caveats and hedges toward what they said. Every statement is couched in, I'm sure there's someone in the room who knows more about this than me, but because everyone is desperate to avoid public embarrassment. And it seems to be something you're not doing.
If I was worried about being embarrassed, I wouldn't be actually influencing the people that I'm influencing.
And to learn that you are a quantum physicist?
I'm a theoretical physicist, and I'm also writing a book with Stephen Hawking. Would you like to have a short course in quantum mechanics sometime so that we can straighten out your misuse of quantum notation?
What is it about Deepak's use of quantum physics that bothers you?
The term non-local, the use was not correct.
I think consciousness is non-local.
Yeah, I've never really run across a definition of consciousness that I understood. So maybe you could teach.
Well, again, so this is another issue that I have with a lot of these discussions about quantum mechanics is what he might be saying. So what Deepak could be saying might be true in the idealist context, but of course, a physicist like, this guy is going to look at it from a physicalist perspective. So it's actually going to be different. Right. So because consciousness is an emergent phenomena on a physicalist basis, then of course you're not going to see consciousness as non-local. Right. So that's just an important point to point out.
Yeah, if I understood him correctly, it sounds like the guy had a problem with his use of non-local depending on his definition of consciousness.
Right.
And then the guy tried to say, well, I've never really heard a definition of consciousness that I've really understood.
Yeah.
And that's one of those escape routes that I think is kind of cheap.
Mm-hmm.
I think... I don't know. We've already gone over the definition of consciousness, so we don't need to do that.
Teach me something.
A superposition of possibilities.
Okay, well, all right. I know what all each of those words means. I still don't think I know.
I mean, you see where we come from, right? Because quantum mechanics says what the world is different than what we see when we look at it. So it's a small leap from that correct statement to we bring the world into existence by looking at it, right? And then you're Deepal Chopra. And Deepak, he's found me on Twitter. So whenever I tweet something about quantum mechanics, he retweets it with something, but it's all in your mind. It's all consciousness bringing the world into existence.
He loves word salad. Yeah. That guy is the biggest dealer of word salad the world has ever known.
The genius is putting the word salad into a recipe that people think is nutritious for them, right? They really like to eat, even though there's no actual nutritional value.
Well, a friend of mine gave me a Deepal Chopra book, and I started going through
Well, I think the problem is, again, that someone like Sean Carroll and someone like Deepak are going to have two totally different ontological views. So they're going to have two different views on what quantum mechanics actually tells us, right? So, like I know Sean Carroll, he holds to the many worlds interpretation. So of course it's not going to sound right to him when you talk about the observer effect and stuff. So, I just want to point that out to people, but yeah.
And I was like, this guy's crazy, right? Like, I mean, he probably wants to do well. Like, probably not a terrible person, but he's also ignoring the actual scientists that study all this stuff. And he's pitching this thing, this sort of like pseudo quasi-spiritual view of the world. But the reason why Deepak can do that is because most people don't understand what he's talking about. I see what you're doing. You're throwing a bunch of very complicated words that aren't in most people's vernacular, and you're saying them in a way that makes me feel like you have some sort of a connection to the chi and to the chakras and to the inner whatever that everybody's trying to reach to be happy.
Yeah, and another problem is just that whenever there is a field, whether it's physics or medicine or whatever, where we know something, but it's hard, complicated, counterintuitive, when we explain it, we translate, right? In physics, we have mathematical equations that are quite unambiguous as to what they say, but then we use words. We say, well, there's a cloud, there's a probability, etc. And every translation is inaccurate in some sense. So if you are basing your beliefs off the translations, then you can fudge them a little bit more to get almost wherever you want to go.
So at this point in history, it might just be a well-known fact that Deepak Chopra is the go-to archetype of new age woo and nonsensical word salad.
Have been subjected to a kind of word salad of scientific jargon, used out of context inappropriately, apparently uncomprehendingly.
I would like to remind you that ad hominem is a logical fallacy, and that's science 101. You should know that.
Ad hominem means
this is my turn to speak, sir. Okay? You accuse me of jargon. You accuse me of misusing language. How many people understood what I was saying?
You're lying.
Since this debate that he had with Sam Harris and Michael Shermer, it doesn't really seem like he's learned more about quantum physics. What it seems like Deepak has actually learned is to surround himself with people who can look like they're doing real science or seem like they're actually intellectual and appealing to real science. Instead of relying upon the hopefully sympathetic theoretical physicist in the audience, Deepak is going to provide his own pseudoscientists to try and make reasonable seeming cases for his worldview. And that's what Bernardo is. And I bet it's actually a pretty great deal for Bernardo because through hooking up with Deepak, someone who's really famous, I bet it brings Bernardo a lot of attention, a lot of fame, and potentially even some wealth.
I have today a wonderful guest that we're going to add to this series, which has been very exciting, Bernardo. We have had Nobel laureates. We've had Don Hoffman, who you know, and Nina Scavajos. Recently, I had Frank Wilczek, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and also Brian Keating, who's the head of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Imagination.
You have an excellent company.
Yeah, they're an excellent company. So today, I'm so happy to have you. So first of all, welcome.
I'm happy to talk to you always, Deepak. It's a pleasure.
So this is all just talking about non-locality and quantum physics. He's just like, this proves materialism. It's like, no, it doesn't. I'm not hearing a good argument for that. We're not even hearing that argument. We're just hearing the assertion of his conclusion, and he's pointing to these things as evidence without really getting into it. I don't want to bog down my talk with evidence and proof and good reasons. You just take my word for it, okay?
The inevitable conclusion is that the universe is entirely mental, and therefore we are
Don't add something here.
mind at large, whose second-person perspective is
What was
the
that?
innate universe we see.
Real quick, I feel I am getting the sense that there's this very subtle guilt by association that's happening here, where like he's trying to say, oh, look at how Deepak Chopra, he's this woo guy who's known for his word salads and trying to hoodwink people, according to him. And he says that, Kastrup associates with him, and he's rubbing shoulders with them and all that. And so, without saying it, I feel like he's sort of trying to lump them into the same category.
Yeah,
but,
that's just not true.
Yeah, I don't mean to misrepresent Long, but that's that's sort of the vibe I'm getting from what he's doing there. So, and now Kastrup is an actual, he has 2 PhDs, he's an actual philosopher. He publishes stuff that's peer-reviewed. So if he's trying to sort of put him on the same level as Deepak, that's really not going to hold water.
Right.
So that was his entire case. Pure assertion, a couple
Okay, that
of
wasn't
appeals
his
to authority.
That wasn't his case, though. He wasn't trying to make a case. Oh my God, this was horrible.
And this is his earlier stuff too, like not the excuses or anything like that, but he was, as you know, Jacob Hart pointed out, this is just more of an explanatory video he's doing anyway. But his idealism and his arguments have gotten far more sophisticated. So for him to pick a video from many years ago and just not even consider all his other work is just
it's bad.
A few things he was able to grab up from scientific looking sources, and hey, this looks like this, so this, bad logic, causation, correlation, fallacies, begging the question all over the place, circular reasoning, pretty pathetic.
No. What are the implications for healthcare?
Implications for healthcare. I think he's just going to go on to argue that we need also interior methods of healing, not just exterior methods of healing, because we know about placebo effects and all this kind of stuff, right? And I don't disagree with that at all. I actually do agree with that. But I think the problem with this kind of thing is that people who think like this then start arguing things like, well, if you're sick, it's your fault because you think bad. Maybe you need to change the way that you think about things.
Okay, that's not that's not what he's saying, though. Oh my God. Anyways.
Stuff like this. And I mean, it's not to say that some of that stuff isn't true, but we also could potentially get into victim blaming with that kind of stuff. And that's not good either. So I think I'm not going to go any further into this. There's nothing good here. There's not a single good argument in this thing.
And when Bernardo says,
to say that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain is the mere labeling of a fundamental unknown. We just give it a name and we feel warm and fuzzy as if we had explained anything. Nothing has been explained.
Bernardo is such a hypocrite. At the end of the day, he literally has no good evidence for his ideas. It's pure storytelling. And he's going to talk about giving something a name and then feeling warm and fuzzy about it without actually having established anything. This applies to him and what he's doing way more than it applies to science. Just like what they're talking about is dogma and orthodoxy, way more than that applies to science. These guys are constantly dragging science and our most valid theories down to their level as an insult, while they do it themselves, but worse.
See, one person getting it really, really wrong in a bold kind of way can actually confuse a lot of other people, and they can pass on their bad ideas like a mental virus. He's doing some harmful stuff here. In this case, and in many other cases, it seems pretty clear that the people are actually influenced by some religious idea, but they don't want to say the S word.
The S word, which I try to avoid.
You're a wolf in sheep's clothing. You're out here pretending to be a scientist while you're peddling religious ideas. I'm not into that. So with someone like him, it may not seem
again,
like a fallacy. Like
we have to distinguish between a theory and the implications. So just because a theory implies some religious ideas, that doesn't make the theory false, right? We have to sort of understand.
Yeah, even if you don't like that there are religious connotations to it, you still have to assess the arguments based on whether it's valid and whether the premises are true, all of that.
Right, so.
You can easily argue in reverse, right? That applies equally to materialism. You think, oh, that has atheistic implications and everything else that follows with it. So that same sword can be pointed right back at you.
Yep, exactly.
Necessarily advocating for a religious dogma, although he kind of is. He just isn't explicitly telling you that's what he's doing. He's trying to make a reasonable seeming case for it. And he is taking that myth literally. And it is clear from the way that he talks about this thing in reasonable sounding terms that he believes in this myth of us being archetypes in the mind of God. And he's looking for a literal way to describe it. They want to act like it's literally true. And that's exactly what he's doing. There's nothing transrational about this. If he was saying poetically, metaphorically, hey, we're all archetypes in the mind of God. God is the universe. We're all aspects of the universe in flux. We're all interconnected. We're all part of the universe. We're all out here playing these parts out and relating to different aspects of ourself in time. I'd be like, okay, that's fine. That's valid poetry. That's true. That's a helpful way to look at our experience. All good. You start actually taking that poetry literally and wanting to make a literal case for how we know it's literally true. It's like, whoa, man, you've gone too far. That's pre-trans confusion right there. That is not literally true. It's poetically true. Come back to reality and maybe start to re-include science.
So at the end of the day, we've seen that Bernardo has 0 good points. None of his ideas stand. They're all like as above, so below, and this looks like that. Appeals to authority, circular reasoning, assertion, storytelling. And we've seen what happened. In 2010, Deepal Chopra got schooled by a bunch of people who actually do real quantum physics. And instead of ever learning, all he did was surround himself by people who will look like they're scientific and appeal to science and act like their ideas are reasonable. They really care more about the narrative that they're crafting than they do about the actual truth, about peddling these ideas that they have built an empire around than they do about what's actually true. These guys are not trustworthy. They are con men. They are profiting off of this idealistic, religious, new age bullshit. This stuff is superstitious nonsense.
Thanks everybody for watching. Make sure you subscribe and ring the bell and like.
Yeah, it's just, it's bad.
All right.
If you go down,
go ahead.
If you go down to the comments, it's there's a lot of negative stuff. And look at that dislike ratio. Like, oh man, I'm just gonna dislike that right now. Oh man.
Yeah,
It's
the
bad.
good thing is, somebody in the comments, I think the most liked one, talked about how he would like to have a discussion with him. So
Yeah.
he may appear, I don't know if it's going to be
Again.
live, but again, talking about this.
Mhm.
So I don't know if he'll hear our video before then or not, but hopefully he takes what we said into consideration before he gets into that discussion, because he's probably going to run into a lot of the same things that we've said. There's similar people in the audience who were in the comments on his video saying similar things as us.
Yeah.
That we've added a bit more detail. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah. All right, that'll be it. But yeah,
Okay,
it was.
So, any other thoughts you'd like to add about the video?
It's just really bad. A lot of misrepresentation. Didn't really understand the argument. Didn't even. I think the biggest. Okay, so the biggest problem with his video was that it's kind of like we were talking about earlier, where he's forgetting that the video itself, like the video that he's critiquing, it's not an argumentative video, right? He's just explaining what his theory is. He actually has arguments defending that theory, so it's not like he's presenting the theory and that's it. Like, it's not like he's acting like that's the only video he's ever made and that's the end of it. Like, no, he actually has arguments to defend his theory, right? And I think that's an important point to make, because he just kept saying, oh, well, you know, what's your evidence, right? Well, he actually has evidence. He has books. He has a website. He has videos talking about these. He has a lot of interviews talking about this stuff. Like, it's really
if you want, I mean, do you have a specific video that lays out your argument for idealism, or a playlist?
Probably just my case for idealism. That video series.
Okay.
Although I use different arguments. If you want to see another, I did a debate on idealism. My debate with Thomas, I forgot his last name, but I debated a guy around last year of December. His name was Thomas, and I presented a few arguments for idealism as well.
Is that the Christian physicalist?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
That guy, yeah. So that as well.
Cool. And I have a playlist called The Case for Monistic Idealism. It includes videos mainly from like inspiring philosophy, but another user that goes into how monism plays into this.
Yeah.
And you know, I've made some arguments, like the argument from mental causation. You've probably seen that on Kyle's channel, presented there. That's an argument I like to give for idealism. I like to give like a reformulated argument, like a reformulated version of the introspective argument. I think that's a good one.
Yeah.
I have my own version of that they present, and then there's arguments from parsimony and things like that. And of course, there's you know, like an argument from elimination, like a kind of argument that Sherlock Holmes would give for idealism. So I think, I think we've just about answered just about everything he has to say. If there's anything more, we can respond later, but I think that about does it.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully Bernardo Kastrup, I don't know if Bernardo Kastrup will see this, but I guess one last announcement is that I am going to, me and Monistic Idealism here are going to be talking to Kastrup at the end of May. So May 31st is going to be the day that we are going to be having Kastrup on my channel, and we're going to be discussing the biggest problem for idealism, which is explaining how you get micro minds like us to come from a macro mind. And that's basically, it's going to be a big discussion about like dissociative identity disorder and all that stuff, because we have a few new ideas that we want to present to Kastrup. So that'll be very, very interesting.
Yeah, it'll be a bit more technical, but it'll be entertaining. It'll be fun.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. Well, hope everybody enjoyed the video. It was great hanging out with you, Kyle, and talking with you guys. So take care.
All right. Later.